Happy, particularly preposterous packaging day.
I'm sorry, what was that?
You heard me. Happy, particularly preposterous packaging day. I am reading right now from an actual document. It's an email.
An email from where?
From the United States Attorney's Office.
Yeah.
Southern District of New York. The document ID is EFTA 00009939.
Okay.
It's dated August 7th, 2020. And the subject line is literally the week ahead. The opening line from, a senior official to their entire team is what I just read.
August 2020. So let's place that. That is deep in the fallout. Ghislaine Maxwell has been arrested. The world is watching every single move that office makes in relation to the Epstein case.
It's radioactive.
Yeah.
And the email, it just continues. The website puts it best by saying there really is no right or wrong way to celebrate the day. In any event, no need for any packaging at all on the weekly update. It's so normal. This is the kind of banal office chatter you'd see anywhere.
Yeah, but that's the point, isn't it? Because sitting right next to that email in our digital stack of files is another document, EFTA 02731393.
And that one is, well, it's a handwritten note.
Mm-hmm.
It looks like it was scrawled in a moment of sheer terror. It describes a fleshed fetus in a toilet, and it's screaming for help.
And that contrast, that right there, is the entire story we're diving into today.
Welcome to the deep dive. We're doing something a little different this time around. We're not retelling the story you've seen on Netflix or read in the headlines.
No, we're approaching this as a forensic unit. Imagine we're the ICIJ or ProPublica. We have been handed a massive raw dump of PDFs.
We're talking court records, internal financial audits, pilot logs, FBI evidence inventory. It's all here. Our mission today is to strip away the narrative and just look at the data. What do the documents actually say?
And what's so striking as I was preparing for this, going through these thousands and thousands of pages, is that very tension you just highlighted. On the one hand, you have the bureaucracy, the happy packaging day emails, the tax codes, the flight forms.
The system.
And on the other hand, you have this raw, visceral human horror that the system was for decades, containing and enabling.
And that's the truly terrifying part, I think. The system didn't break. For 20 years, the system did exactly what it was designed to do. It processed forms, it settled lawsuits, it logged flight hours, and in doing so, it created a shield for a monster.
So before we open that first file, we need to establish some rules of engagement. Because if we're going to do this forensically, we have to be disciplined.
Right.
We need to clearly separate three things. First, there's fact.
Fact. If it's written in a court transcript, if it's a line item in a flight log, we can state it as a fact.
Exactly. We can quote it. Second, there's interpretation.
And that's when we connect the dots.
Right.
We take a name from a flight log and connect it to a financial transaction in another report to identify a pattern.
Yes, and we will always label that as our interpretation of the data. And finally, the third category is open questions.
The gaps, the redactions, the things the documents don't say, the things that maybe got shredded before the FBI showed up.
And this is the most important rule. No outside rumors.
Uh-huh.
For the next hour, if it is not in one of these PDFs, it does not exist. We are building our findings based only on this stack of evidence.
Okay, so let's get into it. Where do we begin?
We have to start where this entire criminal enterprise started. With movement, with logistics.
The plane.
Section 1 of our investigation. The logistics of anonymity. The flight logs.
Now, everyone has heard about the flight logs. It's become this piece of modern folklore. People imagine it's just this master list of every famous person who ever flew with them.
Right.
But I'm looking at the raw documents here. EVF 00000075, and I have to say, it's surprisingly boring. Administratively, I mean. It looks like a shipping manifest from a trucking company.
It does, and that's the trap. That administrative boredom is the camouflage. If you just glance at it, you miss the entire mechanism of the abuse. To see it, you have to dig into the methodology of the pilot himself, a man named David Rogers.
And we have his deposition, right?
We do. Document EFTA 02731168. And in it, he explains exactly how the system of invisibility worked.
Okay, I have it open. He's being questioned here about how he recorded his passengers. And he draws a very, very clear line.
A critical distinction. And to get it, you have to understand a little bit about aviation law. There is a world of difference between flying internationally and flying domestically.
Okay.
If you fly from, say, New York to Paris or Palm Beach to London, you are crossing a sovereign border. Customs and Border Protection requires a full, accurate passenger manifest. It's not optional. You need names, passport numbers, birth dates.
You can't just write some guy on that form.
You can't fake it without committing a major, easily traceable federal crime. And so when we look at the logs for those international trips, what do we see?
We see names.
Yeah.
We see Jeffrey Epstein. We see Ghislaine Maxwell. We see other known associates listed clearly. The data is there. It's granular.
But now look at the domestic flights, the trips from Palm Beach to Santa Fe, New York to Little St. James in the Virgin Islands. What does Roger say his practice was for those flights?
I'm reading from the transcript of his deposition. It says, when he did not know the name of a passenger, Rogers ordinarily would make a generic notation.
A generic notation. Read some of them.
1 female, 2 females, sometimes just 1 passenger.
Or
What goal?
1 female.
Yeah.
Just stop and think about that for a second. The dehumanization required to do that. You're the pilot of a multi-million-dollar private jet. You look back into the cabin, you see a young woman, maybe she looks like a teenager, sitting there. You don't ask her name, you don't check her ID, you just turn back to your clipboard and you write down 1 female.
It's a ghost record. It's an entry that's designed to say nothing.
It's what we're calling administrative invisibility. And Rogers is explicit about why he did it. He says, and I'm quoting his testimony, he explained he was not required to identify his passengers unless crossing an international border.
So the system allowed it?
The system encouraged it. For a private domestic flight, you don't file a passenger manifest with the FAA. All you need is a head count for the plane's weight and balance calculations. That's it.
So he just writes 1 female, clicks his pen, fires at the engines, and takes off. And whoever that person was, she is now effectively erased from the historical record. If you're an investigator 2 decades later trying to find her, you're literally searching for 1 female in a database of thousands and thousands of flights.
It's worse than a needle in a haystack. It's a needle that's been painted to look exactly like a piece of hay. Epstein didn't need some sci-fi cloaking device. He just needed to stay within the borders of the United States, and he could move human beings around like they were boxes of cargo. The loophole wasn't some grand criminal conspiracy. It was a feature of aviation bureaucracy.
There is one name, though, that almost never gets that generic treatment. One name that appears with a frequency that is just.
Yeah, it is.
It's jarring when you see it all laid out.
Ghislaine Maxwell.
Absolutely. I'm looking at the logs from 1997. This is from document EFTA 000000000078. It's relentless. February 6th, JFK to Heathrow. March 19th, Palm Beach to JFK. May 27th, May 31st, June 23rd, August 6th, October 17th. On and on.
That is not the travel schedule of a friend or a guest who's just tagging along for a holiday.
No.
That's an operational tempo. That is the schedule of an employee, a manager.
It looks like a commute.
It is a commute, a transatlantic, multi-million-dollar commute. When you see that kind of frequency spanning months, crossing oceans, you are looking at someone who is absolutely integral to the operation of the machine. She isn't just a passenger. She is managing the logistics of movement.
And if we stick to our rules, fact versus interpretation, the fact is her name is on those manifests. The interpretation is that she held a position of authority and permanence that the anonymous 1 female passengers clearly did not. She was the constant. They were the disposable variable.
Precisely. Which brings us to the next logical question in any investigation. Running a Gulfstream jet like it's a city bus is astronomically expensive. I mean, you are burning through thousands of dollars an hour in just fuel and maintenance, not to mention pilot salaries, landing fees, hangar costs. To keep a machine like this airborne, you need money, and not just, bags of cash. You need access to a sophisticated, legitimate, high-level financial system.
And that takes us to Section 2 of our investigation, the financial labyrinth. This is where I think the public understanding of Epstein gets a little fuzzy.
Yeah.
We hear the word financier, but if you ask somebody what he actually did, was he a stockbroker, a hedge fund guy? What was his product?
The documents tell us exactly what his product was. He was a tax architect for the ultra-wealthy. And to really understand that, we have to do a deep dive into a very specific, very revealing document. It's called the Deschert Report.
Let me pull that up. Document ID EFT 02730996. So for context, this is a report from an internal investigation. It was commissioned by the board of Apollo Global Management, the massive private equity firm. And they hired this big law firm, Genio LLP, to investigate the relationship between their founder and CEO, Leon Black, and Jeffrey Epstein.
And this document, it is a masterclass in corporate damage control. The entire intent of this report is to exonerate Apollo. It is written by lawyers, for lawyers, to create a legal shield around the corporation. It is trying so hard to say, nothing to see here, Apollo did nothing wrong. But in the process of explaining why they're innocent, it accidentally reveals Epstein's entire business model.
It keeps coming back to one specific financial instrument, a GRAT, G-R-A-T. I've counted it dozens of times in this report.
A grantor retained annuity trust? You know how one of those works?
I have a vague idea. It's some kind of trust for rich people, but the definition in the report here, it's pretty technical.
Let's break it down, because this is the key. This is why a billionaire like Leon Black would keep a man like Jeffrey Epstein on the payroll for years after he was a convicted sex offender. So imagine you're a billionaire. You have an asset, let's say it's $100 million worth of stock, in a company you think is about to go public and explode in value.
I'm holding the stock.
You want to pass that future growth on to your children. But if you wait for it to grow to, say, $500 million and then just give it to them, you get hit with a massive gift tax or estate tax. The government wants its cut, which can be around 40%.
And billionaires don't like paying 40% tax.
Nobody does. So you call your guy, Jeffrey Epstein. He tells you to set up a juror. You put that initial $100 million of stock into the trust for a fixed period, let's say 2 years. The trust is legally structured to pay you, the grantor, back an annuity. And that annuity payment is designed to equal your original $100 million plus a tiny amount of interest that's set by the IRS every month. That's called the hurdle rate. Let's say it's 2%.
So, on paper, it looks like I'm just getting my own money back with a tiny bit of interest. No gift has been made.
Exactly. The IRS looks at the transaction and says, okay, no gift here, nothing to tax. But, and this is the whole game, if your stock appreciates by, say, 50%, way more than that 2% hurdle rate, all of that extra growth, all those extra millions, remain in the trust at the end of the term.
And the trust then goes to
your kids, your beneficiaries. And because, on paper, the IRS assumed the asset wouldn't grow that fast, that massive transfer of wealth happens completely, 100% tax-free. You've just moved tens of millions of dollars out of your taxable estate and into the next generation's hands.
And the Deschert report confirms that Epstein was the one setting these up for Leon Black.
The report states explicitly that Black paid Epstein millions upon millions of dollars for trust and estate planning advice.
Yeah.
And it specifically highlights his work structuring these GRATs. So you see, Epstein wasn't just some court jester hanging around parties. He was a technician. He was providing a high-value service that saved these guys a fortune.
That changes the entire power dynamic. He wasn't just a parasite living off their wealth. He was adding to it. He was indispensable.
He was a profit center for their personal balance sheets. And when you save a man $50 million in taxes, he's much more likely to overlook your, let's call them personal eccentricities.
But the report really tries to downplay this, doesn't it? I'm looking at the language they use. They keep calling Epstein a passive investor.
Passive investor. It's such a carefully chosen, sanitized phrase. It implies distance. It suggests he just parked some money and didn't really do anything.
Right.
But then you have to look at the actual investments they list in the report.
I see a few. There's one called Financial Trust Company, and then this one, Environmental Solutions Worldwide.
ESWW, an emissions control company. The report admits that in 2011, and the date here is critical, 2011 is 3 years after Epstein's Florida conviction, 3 years after he was a registered sex offender, he co-invested in this company alongside Leon Black.
So wait a minute. On one page, the report is trying to say Apollo, the company, didn't do business with him. But on the next, they're admitting that Apollo's CEO and Epstein are personally investing in the same niche company together.
That's the needle they try to thread. They argue it wasn't Apollo's money, it was Leon Black's personal money. But from a forensic investigative standpoint, that is a distinction without a difference. They were in business together. They were moving money together.
And here's the line in this document. It's on page 12.
Yeah.
That just made my jaw drop. Referring to that 2011 co-investment, it says, Black did not recall that transaction almost a decade later.
Can you imagine?
No.
That is the ultimate expression of billionaire privilege. Oh, that time I invested millions of dollars in an obscure environmental company with a convicted sex offender. Sorry, it slipped my mind. It was a Tuesday.
It was a financial rounding error for him.
Right. But for Epstein, it wasn't an error. It was an anchor. Every GRAT he structured, every co-investment he made, every dollar he moved through an entity called Financial Trust Company, he was weaving himself deeper and deeper into the legitimate financial infrastructure of Wall Street.
It dismantles that whole lone wolf predator narrative.
Yeah.
He wasn't an outsider. He was deeply embedded.
He was part of the fabric, and that financial integration, That's what bought him protection. It made him useful. And when you are useful to powerful people, the legal system tends to treat you very, very differently.
Which leads us directly to what is, for me, the most infuriating section of these files. Section 3. The legal firewall.
We're jumping now to the 2006-2008 period. This is the first federal investigation in Florida, the one that resulted in that infamous plea deal. And we have the documents. We have transcripts and depositions about the negotiations between the U.S. Attorney's Office and Epstein's legal team.
I'm looking at a set of them here. EFT 0000901692299448. Reading through these, you really get a sense of the gears of the justice system grinding, but grinding in a very particular preordained direction.
On one side of the table, you have the federal prosecutors. The office is led at the time by Alexander Acosta. On the other side, you have Epstein's dream team of defense attorneys. We're talking heavy hitters like Jerry Lefcourt, Ken Starr.
And reading the deposition about those meetings, it feels less like a criminal prosecution and more like, I don't know, a corporate merger negotiation. They're just hammering out the terms of a deal.
Look at the main point of leverage. What was the defense team's #1 argument for keeping Epstein out of a real prison?
It's right here in the deposition, line 22. It was the expression of concern by the defense team that Epstein wanted to avoid being incarcerated in the state system because of concerns for his physical safety.
Concerns for his physical safety. Let's just unpack the audacity of that. Their argument was that because their client was so wealthy and so high profile, he would be a target in a normal prison. He might get hurt.
And the prosecutors, they bought that.
The document says the concern was accommodated, and that accommodation is what led to the completely unprecedented deal where he got to serve his time in a private wing of the county jail and was let out for work release 12 hours a day, 6 days a week.
So the very wealth and notoriety that enabled his crimes became the excuse for why he couldn't be punished like a normal criminal.
It's a perfect catch-22 of privilege. But to get the prosecutors to that point, to get them to agree to such a sweetheart deal, the defense had to do more than just say he was scared. They had to systematically dismantle the case against him, which meant they had to destroy the credibility of his victims.
And that brings us to document EFT 00009448. This is the memo that outlines what we're calling the discrepancy strategy.
This document is it's difficult to read, not because it's graphically violent, but because it is so profoundly, deeply cynical. Walk us through it.
They are comparing a victim's initial interview with a detective in 2005 to her testimony before a grand jury a year later in 2006.
Right. It says, reading the transcript, there were a few discrepancies. And then it lists them. Listen to this specific one. They're focused on the sexual activity, and it comes out that she wasn't wearing her underwear. She does not recall how they came off. She cannot remember removing her underwear. She knows her underwear was off, but she cannot tell you exactly at what point her underwear was removed. Just pause there. Think about the standard of memory being demanded. They are insisting that a traumatized teenage girl, in the middle of being sexually abused by a powerful, manipulative older man, should have a perfect, second-by-second chronological recall of the mechanics of how she was undressed.
It's an impossible standard.
It's a standard no one could meet. It continues, right?
It goes on. The third is the sexual activity. When detective comes and sees her again a few weeks later, she does something else. They are microscopically dissecting every tiny variation in her account over time to build a narrative that she's an unreliable liar.
This is the weaponization of psychology. We know now, and any competent forensic psychologist knew then, that trauma fundamentally alters memory consolidation. When your body is in a state of extreme stress and fear, your brain goes into survival mode. You remember sensory fragments, the smell of the room, the color of the walls, the feeling of fear, but your hippocampus, a part of the brain that sequences events, it gets scrambled.
So you might remember the assault, but not whether your shirt came off before your pants.
Exactly. And the legal system, or at least Epstein's defense team, exploited that scientific reality. They took the normal, predictable neurological response to trauma and presented it as proof of deception.
And because the prosecutors were already predisposed to find a way out to accommodate Epstein's safety concerns, they went along with it.
It gave them the justification they needed. They were searching for the mythical, perfect victim, someone with a flawless memory, no complicated past, and a story that never wavered. And when they couldn't find one, because perfect victims don't exist, they let the predator walk.
It's just a machine designed to dissect the powerless. You can just picture these $1 million an hour lawyers in a fancy conference room, picking apart a traumatized girl's memory, arguing over underwear timestamps, all to make sure their client gets to keep his comfortable life.
And this all comes back to that email we started with, the Happy Packaging Day email. That's the culture this was happening in. These prosecutors, these officials, they aren't cartoon villains. They're bureaucrats. They're people who send silly emails about novelty holidays because they want to get through the week. They want to clear cases off their desks. They want to avoid a long, messy public trial against a defendant with unlimited resources.
The banality of evil. It's not a cliche here. It's a documented legal strategy. Epstein's whole defense was built on the bet that the system would choose bureaucratic convenience over justice for powerless girls.
And for more than a decade, that bet paid off. The file was closed, the GRATs kept generating tax-free wealth, the Gulf Stream kept logging flights for one female, but eventually the sheer weight of the crimes and maybe a change in the cultural winds finally cracked that firewall open.
Which brings us to 2019, the final collapse. And that takes us to Section 4, the Archive of Horror.
When the FBI finally raided Epstein's Manhattan townhouse in July of 2019, they generated what's called a chain of custody log for the evidence they seized. We have those inventories. Documents, EFTIL 02730-486 and EPA 02730-741.
I've looked at a lot of search warrant inventories for our deep dives. Usually it's, pretty dry stuff. Item 1, one laptop computer. Item 2, one box of financial records. This list is something else. It goes on for page after page. They had to divide his massive townhouse into search zones. A Bravo zone, a Charlie zone, a Delta zone. It reads like they're clearing a hostile military compound, not searching a home on the Upper East Side.
Just read out some of the items they logged. What did they find in there?
It's the mixture of the mundane and the deeply sinister that's so unsettling. You've got massage pads, loose currency, then hard drives, dozens of them. CDs, hundreds and hundreds of CDs and binders, psychological notes, message pads.
Yeah.
This one. Fake NY driver's license.
Stop right there. A fake NY driver's license? No, why? Why does a billionaire who is famous enough to have his own initials on the tail of his private jet need a fake ID?
A go bag.
Yeah.
An escape plan.
Or a way to open anonymous bank accounts. Or rent apartments where he doesn't want his name on the lease. A fake ID isn't something you just have, it's tradecraft. It suggests a level of operational security, a plan to run, or a part of his life that he was living completely off the books. It's not the kind of thing a simple passive investor keeps in his desk.
And then, buried in all of that digital hardware and massage equipment, they found paper. And this is where we come back to that handwritten note we mentioned at the very beginning. Document EFT 02731393.
And we should warn you again, the content here is extremely disturbing. But it's essential. We have to read it because the single piece of paper annihilates the carefully constructed persona of this sophisticated financier. It yanks the story out of the abstract world of tax law and flight codes and slams it down into visceral, physical reality.
It's a handwritten note. The writing is jagged. It looks frantic. You can feel the distress in the pen strokes. It reads, "You have made me numb." So it came out in the toilet, and I didn't know what to do, so I just flushed the tiny little fetus. Where is Ghislaine?
3 exclamation points after, where is Ghislaine?
It goes on, I am not your personal incubator.
This document, this is arguably the single most high-value piece of evidence in the entire stack when it comes to understanding the human impact. Just break down what it tells us. That first line, where is Ghislaine?
It's a screen for the manager.
It is a screen for the manager. It establishes the hierarchy. When this victim experiences this unbelievable trauma, a miscarriage, alone, in a toilet, her first instinct isn't to call 911. It isn't to call for Jeffrey Epstein. It is to call for Ghislaine. It powerfully suggests that Ghislaine was the fixer, the cleaner, the one who handled the human wreckage of this operation.
And that phrase, I am not your personal incubator.
The language of ownership. Incubator is a word you use for a machine, for livestock. It's profoundly dehumanizing. And you have made me numb that speaks to chronic, repeated abuse. This wasn't a single isolated event. This note is the sound of a breaking point.
The big forensic question for me is, why did he keep it? Why was this note found in his safe or his desk? Why would you keep a record of something so damning?
And that's the open question, isn't it? Was it a trophy? A token of a conquest? Was it blackmail material he was holding over Ghislaine? Or was he just a hoarder of control? Predators often do this. They keep souvenirs. They document their own atrocities.
It's the ultimate counterweight to all the sterile legal documents. You can file a DREDIT with the IRS. You can file a flight plan with the FAA.
Yeah.
But you cannot file this. This is the horror that doesn't fit in the filing cabinet.
And speaking of things that don't fit, In any big forensic audit like this, you always find anomalies. You find documents that make you stop and just go, wait a second, what is this doing here?
Which brings us to Section 5, Anomalies and Unanswered Questions.
Let's start with the Tartaglione document.
Okay, I have it. EFT 000000996. It's a very short document, looks like a news clipping or maybe an internal law enforcement brief. It just mentions the name Tartaglione.
Nicholas Tartaglione,
Yeah.
a former NYPD officer, a bodybuilder, and a man accused of a quadruple murder.
The document says the four men's bodies were found buried on Tartaglione's sprawling animal rescue farm in Otisville, Orange County. Tartaglione has been locked up since December 2016 and still does not have a trial date.
So the question is, why is a briefing about a quadruple homicide on an animal rescue farm in the Epstein case files?
Well, the public reporting suggests they were cellmates, or at least in the same unit, at the Metropolitan Correctional Center in Manhattan during Epstein's final days.
Right. But the fact that this specific document with this grisly detail about 4 bodies buried on a farm was preserved in the file, it suggests a proximity to a kind of brutal, violent criminality that is miles away from the white-collar world of GRATs and private jets. We think of Epstein in tuxedos at charity galas. At the end, he was locked in a cage with a man accused of burying 4 people in his backyard.
It just raises so many questions about who he was talking to in those last days, what was being said in that cell. The document is a clue, but the context is a huge open question.
And then there are the really weird things. The magazine scraps. Documents, IFTE 0273-1361 and IFTE 0273-1433.
Yeah, these are just odd. They're clippings. One is an ad for a minivan. A minivan. It says, minivan with front-wheel drive and hefty V6 power.
Why on earth would a man who owns a 727 and a Gulfstream jet be clipping an ad for a minivan?
Inconspicuous transportation. I mean, if you want to move young girls around a city without anyone noticing, you don't use the chauffeured black Mercedes. You use a beat-up Honda Odyssey. It's suburban camouflage.
That is a very dark interpretation, but it fits the pattern of administrative invisibility, doesn't it? And what about the other clipping, the one about Princess Diana?
EFTE is 0273-1433. It's a quote from her from an article titled, "The Way She Was." Diana is quoted saying, "You always think you're prepared for everything and you think you have the knowledge of what's coming ahead."
And this was found among his things.
You always think you're prepared. Was he reading that and thinking about his own downfall?
We can't know for sure. It could be random trash. But in a forensic file for a subject like this, you have to consider everything as potential context. Was he obsessed with the fall of other icons, comparing his fate to that of royalty? The investigator in me says that with a narcissist of this magnitude, nothing is just trash. They see their own story reflected in everything.
Okay, so we've gone through the flight logs, the financial machinery, the legal firewall, and the archive of horror. Now we have to do what we set out to do at the top. We have to synthesize all of this. We need to build our documentary output.
Section 6, the timeline and our key findings. If we were sitting in an edit bay right now, cutting a documentary based only on these files, what's the structure? What's the timeline?
Well, I think the documents clearly break the story down into 4 distinct eras.
Okay, let's build it. Era 1.
Era 1 has to be the era of movement, from about 1992 to 1997. This is the David Rogers era.
Yeah.
The one female era. It's defined by high-frequency travel, Ghislaine Maxwell is the logistics chief, and the perfection of the administrative invisibility system.
Good. Era 2.
The era of immunity, 2006 to 2008. This is the Acosta Plea Deal era. This is when the legal firewall is constructed. The discrepancy strategy is deployed to discredit victims, and his own wealth and fragility are used as a shield against real punishment.
Era 3.
The financial deepening, from roughly 2011 to 2013. This is the post-conviction Apollo era. He's using GRATs, co-investing in companies like ESWW. It proves he's not a social pariah after his first conviction. He's still a valuable partner to the ultra-wealthy.
And finally, Era 4.
The collapse, 2019 to 2020. The FBI raid. The sheer, overwhelming volume of physical evidence, the hard drives, the fake IDs, the handwritten notes, finally becomes too much for the system to contain. The happy packaging day bureaucracy can no longer ignore the reality of the flushed fetus.
Okay, that's a timeline. So what are the top line findings? If you have to write the headline for this entire investigation, what is it?
I think there are 3 key findings that jump out from these documents.
Yep.
Key finding 1. The generic passenger anomaly in the flight logs was not a mistake or lazy bookkeeping. It was a systematic, deliberate tool used to create a shield of anonymity and make victims untraceable. It was a feature, not a bug.
Key finding 2. The legal system was weaponized against victims by exploiting the perfect victim myth. The focus on minor memory discrepancies of traumatic events was a specific strategy used to invalidate their testimony and secure a favorable outcome for a predator.
And go finding 3. Epstein's value to the super-rich was not social, it was technical. His expertise in complex tax avoidance instruments like GRATs made him an indispensable financial asset, which helps explain why powerful people protected him for so long. He was making them richer.
It's a grim but complete picture, and it all points to a man who was pathologically obsessed with one thing.
Control.
Total control. Controlling his tax liability with GRATs, controlling his movements and the records of his victims with pilot codes, controlling the entire legal narrative with an army of the best lawyers money could buy.
But in the end, there were things he couldn't control.
No, he couldn't control the basic biology of the human body, which produced that note about the flushed fetus. He couldn't control the sheer physical accumulation of evidence, the hard drives, the CDs, the driver's licenses, and ultimately, once the dam broke, he couldn't control the public outrage.
Which brings us to our final provocative thought for you, the listener.
We started with that email, right? Happy, particularly preposterous packaging day.
We did.
If we had only these documents, no news reports, no documentaries, no rumors, just this stack of PDFs, the most chilling conclusion we might draw is that the system was working perfectly.
What do you mean by that?
I mean, the pilot, David Rogers, followed FAA regulations. They didn't require names on domestic flights, so he didn't list them. The defense lawyers followed legal procedure. They zealously advocated for their client and negotiated the best possible deal. The financial advisors followed the IRS tax code to the letter to legally minimize their client's tax burden. On paper, everyone was just doing their job.
And yet, a monster was allowed to operate with impunity for decades.
Exactly. The most terrifying takeaway from these documents isn't that the system broke down. It's that the documents showed the system working as designed. It was designed to protect assets. It was designed to negotiate pleas. It was designed to minimize liability. It prioritized procedure over people. It was only when the raw, undeniable human wreckage, the notes, the testimony, the survivor stories became too loud and too voluminous to ignore that the system was finally forced to turn on one of its own.
So the question it leaves you with is, how many other files just like this exist out there, quietly filed away in the system, just waiting for their own version of that handwritten note to finally see the light of day?
That's the question.
This has been The Deep Dive. Keep asking questions.